Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the TSG Live Crew Lounge. I'm John, as usual, and I have 5 friends here, and we're going to talk about something that originally we were going to talk about this last March, and then the pandemic hit, and that got canceled real fast because we couldn't meet in person anymore. So we've adapted to this online format, which is kind of cool because it allows us to bring people in from out of the area. And as a matter of fact, 4 of the 6 people on this stream are from out of the area, out of the immediate Bay Area, anyway. So I'd like to welcome you guys and thank you for coming. And what we're going to be talking about today is narrow gauge. And why don't you guys on the panel introduce yourselves and maybe a little bit about what your interest is or what your involvement is in narrow gauge. And we can start with you, Scott.
Well, John, thank you for having us today. This is a topic that's important to me and in my life. I am from Sacramento, California, which unfortunately didn't have any narrow gauge in our county, but immediately surrounding me, we had the Michigan Cal, which serviced and logged some of the finest white pine and ponderosa pine in the free world. Not too far from me is the West Side Lumber Company, which was the last of the 3-foot loggers in America. And then about 5 hours south of me is the famous Carson in Colorado, which was built either 300 miles too long or 300 years too soon, as Darius Ogden Mills put it on the famous inspection trip that he took when the line was finished. And that ultimately, through a series of corporate transfers, became part of the Southern Pacific Company. And so I'm here today to help represent some of the California narrow gauges and share both modeling and prototype, as I've been a modeler of HON3 and now ON3 for about 20 years. So I'm happy to be here, and thank you, John.
John?
Yeah, hi, my name's John Coker. I'm a native Angelino. I'm 68 years old. I was a lifelong modeler. I've been a modeler since I was about 14 years old. Prior to that, I collected coins and then realized that was a hobby for shut-ins, and I got into my mom made a big mistake of buying me some Lucius Beebe / Charles Clegg books, the King and Queen of Narrow Gauge, and their beautiful and atmospheric rendition of the history of the great railroads of America. And I got interested again, and especially started out as a modeler of or mostly interested in California narrow gauges. I still model Southern Pacific a little bit, but I mostly model Denver and Rio Grande Western and Rio Grande Southern.
Excellent.
SN3, in the scale SN3. Yeah.
And Dave, you've been on our panel discussions before, but maybe you can give everybody a brief rundown for if they weren't watching last time.
Well, yeah, it was probably a good thing if they weren't watching last time. I'm Dave Adams, and I was surprised to learn I've got a year on John Coker. So, heck, I didn't know that. I'm the old man here, I guess. So this
highest in seniority.
Yeah, right. That's it.
You get the job you want, Dave.
Yeah. So I've been lifelong. I guess my parents say since I was probably about 3 interested in trains, and went through the routine. Ended up as a pretty much dyed in the wool HO scale guy, standard gauge. And then I ended up reading a book called Little Engines and Big Men. And that thing, the atmosphere, the railroading, the scale of the people to the trains to the mountains, that just blew me away. So moving down to California, I had a chance meeting with the Grants, got invited up to see what they were doing, and I converted overnight. So sometime in 1973, as I moved from HO standard gauge to quarter-inch narrow gauge and the Denver Rio Grande Western. And I picked that railroad because I didn't know enough to do the research to see if there was something else I might be interested in. So my wife basically said if I had changed scales or gauges, there was going to be heck to pay. So I've been a faithful Rio Grande modeler ever since. So, and building a railroad called the Dorland Branch.
As a matter of fact, if you're interested, you can see a layout tour of Dave's layout that we did here on the channel a while back. It's DURLIN Branch. Maybe check that out later. It's a beautiful layout, Dave. How about you, Doug? You want to tell everybody about you?
First, I want to say thanks for having me on this, John. And this is kind of a new experience for me. So when I stumble, just kick my chair or something, if you can do that from there. I'm Doug Jolley. I've been a lifelong modeler, like most of these guys, probably for forever. I always wondered when I finally got my dream job with the railroad whether I'd still be a modeler, and it slowed me down a little bit, but I stuck with it to the end of my career. So I actually retired about 4 years ago from the Union Pacific, but that journey took me from hiring out in 1979 with the Denver and Rio Grande in Durango, Colorado. As near as I can tell, I was the second to the last narrow gauge employee they ever hired. I've had an interest in the SP narrow gauge most of my life, but when I went to work for the Rio Grande narrow gauge, I kind of felt an allegiance to switch. So I model the Rio Grande now narrow gauge.
We all have our reasons, don't we?
Yeah, well, that was it. And then, of course, I went through the Southern Pacific years with the railroad when Rio Grande and Southern Pacific got together, and got a little interest in the Southern Pacific again, and even the standard gauge a little bit, but still stuck with the narrow gauge. And then, as I say, I retired from the Union Pacific when they went together. So I've kind of had a career that started from a little tourist line on the Heber Creeper in Utah here. I worked there for one summer and then just worked through the whole thing. And 40 years later, here I am running my own railroad here in the basement. So that's kind of my story, and there ain't much else to it.
It's interesting. I think that our other panelist, Adam, had some experience with Heber Creeper too. I don't know if you were thinking about making that part of your intro, Adam, but why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself?
Well, I've grown up in Utah. I've known Doug most of my life. My dad was a huge time narrow gauge fanatic, mostly early Utah narrow gauge, like pre-Rio Grande. And so I grew up, just listening to his research and following that around. And he had a hobby store that I grew up in down in Provo, Utah, called Well Trained. It was a pretty big, good sized hobby store, and it kind of just blossomed the whole modeling aspect for me, growing up with that. And but I decided that I wanted to pursue a career railroading, and so I thought the best thing to do would, start as young as I could. So I started at the Heber, up on the Heber Valley Railroad, the Heber Creeper. Worked up there for quite a few years, probably younger than I should have been, but I started up there when I was about 13, working in the shop just kind of as a gopher. But when I was 18, I hired out with the BNSF and kind of bounced around all around the country, and currently at Amtrak. But I model. I've always been a narrow gauge fan. I mean, I've bounced back and forth. I've done a lot of standard gauge stuff in N scale, but narrow gauge has always been my thing. I've done narrow gauge in every single scale that is available, and some that aren't. I currently have a HON3 railroad in the basement, a FN3 railroad outside, and a 2.5-inch scale railroad outside. The HON3 is kind of loosely based on it is based on the Rio Grande out of Durango and a little bit of the Rio Grande Southern. It's consolidated because I don't have a ton of room right now until the kids move out. But the FN3 is just kind of a bunch of cool stuff that I've picked up that I think is cool that's available. Nothing really modeling anything particular, but the 2.5-inch scale, I'm modeling the Utah and Pleasant Valley, about 1880 Utah. So
I've enjoyed watching the progress reports on the biggest scale that you're working on at your house there. It's really cool. Yeah, some people may recognize Adam. We did a really interesting, I thought, show about insurance. Remember when we went on and talked about your railroad?
How could I forget?
Right, and you talked about your narrow gauge. I mean, sorry, you talked about your N scale layout for that, and you picked up the narrow gauge after you were doing the N scale, right? Wasn't that?
Yeah,
It was in the process of being dismantled, as I recall.
It was a thought. I mean, it had to be a divine intervention, I guess, because I kept on thinking, it's like, why am I building this massive N scale railroad? Like, I love it, but it's really not. It just. The more I got into it, the more I felt like this just really isn't what I love. What I really, really love. And then I started going up to Doug's all the time and playing trains up there, and then I was like, that's it. And then the divine intervention came. My basement flooded, and took it the whole thing out, and insurance decided to pay me off for everything. So I had a whole wad of cash to invest in H2N3. So there we go.
Yeah. Sounds like it worked out pretty well.
Oh, that was fantastic.
Yeah. Sorry, John. I didn't mean to cut you off there.
Adam, so God has a plan is what you're trying to tell us. Huh?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And he's an engager.
Yeah.
So now that we got the introductions out of the way, maybe we should just kind of do a little brief intro about, because some people watching may not realize, what they may be watching going, what are these guys even talking about? What is narrow gauge? And I thought it might be kind of cool to talk about what narrow gauge is, why narrow gauge is, and what kind of industries or railroads, why would they have used narrow gauge? I think that's all relevant to the conversation here. So, what do you think? Anybody can take that. I'm just throwing it out there.
I was saying earlier, we were talking a little bit before the broadcast started, is that the thing that fascinated me about narrow gauge is that most narrow gauge lines were industrial, and they had little tank engines, most of them built by Porter or Davenport. But anyway, a lot of narrow gauge lines were very long, and some of them very sophisticated in their power. And basically what they looked like were miniaturized. The steam locomotives looked like miniaturized versions of standard gauge power. I was always fascinated by the narrowness of the track after growing up and seeing nothing but standard gauge. It's always fascinating.
There's a couple of other things I could chime in about regarding narrow gauge. Just to put it into perspective for the listeners, typically we think of as standard gauge as the 4 feet 8.5 inches. So narrow gauge would be most things under the sun less than that. You have some railways like the Los Angeles street railways that were 3 foot 6 inches. That's considered narrow gauge. Of course, most of us, both in modeling and our prototype interests, are in 3 foot narrow gauge, 36 inches. And then you had a lot of railroads, mostly in the Northeast, like the Maine 2-footers. Those were 2 foot narrow gauges. So there's a lot of different narrow gauges, and they serve different purposes. And one of the things we should tell you is that one of the reasons why there are narrow gauge railroads is not only some of the difficulties of construction involved, but it was more economical all the way around. The equipment is smaller. The construction materials were less and more economical to build. So these corporations, like a mining company or a logging company, they could basically get the same out of a narrow gauge operation that they could with a standard gauge operation for less investment. So that was one of the things that made it profitable to start a narrow gauge in the first place.
Someone's already asking why. I mean, does anybody else want to add to that? I think that was a great explanation, Scott.
One of the things that I might add, John, is that the difference. Some people are confused between gauge and scale. They see it as SN3 or HON3 or ON3. Really what that means is, let's take ON3 for example. What that means is that the scale is actually O scale, and it could be a standard gauge railroad, or it could be as as Scott had said, it could be any gauge of railroad, less than right, there you go. It could be any gauge, any size less than 4 foot 8.5. So basically what that means, ON3 would be O scale, narrow gauge, 3 foot between the rails. That's the gauge.
Right, 3 scale
So
feet, right?
O is the scale, and the 3 is the gauge.
So Dave, you're holding 2 cars. I know what you're doing here. You want to explain that?
Well, I'm just visually demonstrating what Doug just said. The upper car is narrow gauge. This happens to be 1/4 inch scale, so it's ON3, and the bottom car is O scale standard gauge, and this basically is just as a great way that shows the difference. If I had ON2, which I don't, and I piled that on top, it would be again smaller than that. However, a man is the same size for all of the cars. So if you were to put up a figure, and we'll just use this flagman here, if I can get him up here. This flagman is the right size for this large O scale car, and he's also the right size for the narrow gauge car. If I can get him in here, yeah, that's it. So that's what you've got. The difference is the distance between the tracks. The scale is the same. It's all 1/4 inch in this case.
You know, it almost seems like it would be even a more effective demonstration to put the cars this way so they could see the difference between the distance between the wheels, right? Because that's really, because looking at them from the side, it kind of looks like, oh, that's an HO scale car. You know what I mean?
Okay, let me see if okay, there we go. So there's the end views. So the small car is the ON3, 3 feet between the rails. The standard gauge car should be 4 feet 8.5 inches, but it's not. It's 1.25 inches because it's O gauge on that, and that's another. Well, we won't even get into that. So if I were a fine scaler for standard gauge, that would be 4 feet 8.5 inches, but it's not. It's 1.25 inches. But otherwise, the car body and proportions are the same. Again, it's the difference in the track gauge. Hold it up here, see if the tracks. Yeah, there we go. You can see the difference in the distance between the wheels on the trucks. That's
John, I can jump back in and talk about why, in a lot of cases, narrow gauge is appealing to people to model or study. If that might be good to throw out right now.
That's one of the questions that was handed to me. Why do some people choose narrow gauge to model? So please do.
I'll start with that. I'm sure a lot of other people want to chime in, but I think one of the things that's appealing about narrow gauge is this sort of antediluvian feel about it. You had things operating into the era of computer technology that were designed and built, in some cases, 75, 80, 100 years earlier. I just have one example here for everybody to kind of look at. This is an ON3 West Side Lumber caboose, and it might be a little tough to see, but this model and this car in its prototype form, it's built with horizontal siding instead of vertical siding like most standard gauge cabooses were. And you've got these truss rod underframes and these arch bar style trucks, and some narrow gauges operated with straight air. So this whole idea about the nostalgia of narrow gauge is something that attracts all of us. And what you can see out there today is appealing to a lot of people too. But the idea that we still have narrow gauge in a lot of places in our country that's still living and breathing and operating as tourist railroads, that has a huge appeal. Not only that, the scenery. Some of the Colorado narrow gauges are amazingly beautiful. And the California narrow gauges were just absolutely incredible and operated in some of the most picturesque areas. So I think that's one of the reasons we're drawn to narrow gauge.
Yeah, I just recently had a chance to see an SN3 layout that was going to be dismantled. That's a layout tour that's going to come out on the channel here in a couple of weeks or a few weeks. I think 3 weeks from yesterday. And yeah, the scenery definitely was so well done. And I think it had to do with the fact that the person was modeling a bigger scale, bigger than HO. And that gives people a chance to add more details. One of the things I've noticed, and maybe you guys could chime in about this. I mean, because like Doug, you're an SN3 modeler. Do you consider yourself a hardcore modeler? Because it seems to me like the people I've met, like Dave here, seem to be much more hardcore modelers than just your buy the HO stuff and put it on the track out of the box modelers.
Yeah, I would say that I probably was a hardcore.
Are you a
modeler.
glutton for punishment?
Yeah, pretty much. And, I'm fortunate. My wife has kind of taken up the hobby well, and she's gotten to be even worse than me as far as I don't have a problem with laser kits and scribe sighting, but she wants to build everything board by board, and she does a great job doing it. So yeah, we tend to do a lot of that. As far as the railroad itself, I tried real hard when I started to build the railroad to hold it to a strict third division of the Rio Grande prototype. But what I found is that there were a lot of, like you'd say, a lot of hardcore structures that I wanted to build that just didn't fit that railroad. So basically, being a double deck railroad here, I kind of put the third division on the bottom of the railroad, and for the most part, the top deck is a freelance railroad that connects with it. So that allows me the best of two worlds, and there's just a lot of interesting stuff you can do. The narrow gauge went into some wild places. I suppose that was part of the main interest in me. A lot of mountainous territory, or even a lot of desert territory, places that you generally wouldn't see the standard gauge really get into. So, and as Scott said, part of the big interest too was that the equipment, while it was built in the 1880s or turn of the century, was still running in the 50s. And it's how this old antique stuff survived into the later years, and to me that's the fascination. And the Rio Grande tended to stay more standardized, but as he talked, some of the smaller railroads, they did what they had to do to survive. So some of this 1880 stuff really took on some strange configurations to make it last into the later years. So to me, it's all just fascinating.
I was always fascinated by the arcane decadence of narrow gauge equipment. The way it always had the weird look of it. It was just about to fall apart. And people like some old DNRG employees, Doug and I know, like Woody Woodward, would say the first time he worked was training trips on the Colorado narrow gauge out of Alamosa, and he'd see this stuff and he'd go, "What a bunch of junk!" And at one time, a friend of mine and I were discussing railroading, and railroaders always moan about management and how they operate and blah blah blah. And I go, "Why would anybody model this stuff?" And this friend of mine, the late Fred Oster, said, "Because it's fascinating." And I think that's the reason why we're all.
It really is.
Yeah.
Well, I could say one of the cool things that I've noticed about narrow gauge, well, but really, I'm thinking about logging companies in specifically, is that the companies that did these operations just did the most insane things to get the job done. I mean, I've seen pictures of locomotives being strung across valleys on wires to get to the other side so that they could build the track to get the lumber out. And I mean, stuff that a lot of OSHA people would cringe at today. That was it just isn't done anymore. I find that kind of fascinating myself. Do you want to speak? Anybody want to speak to that kind of sort of get it done attitude?
Yeah, I call that the power of American capitalism to get stuff like that done no matter what. And of course I think when you look back on it, and even today with a fabulous technology we have, it still is amazing to watch. But but back in the day, it was amazing what they would do to America was based on extractive industries when the narrow gauge was big, and and what they would do and where they would go and how they would get there was all part of the fascination with the old narrow gauge.
Right.
One of my favorite stories on some extreme measures on delivering a locomotive is, for two cool parts about the story, is one of the American Fork Railroad in Utah. It was a really small railroad out of American Fork, ran up to a little mine up American Fork Canyon, but they actually acquired the very first Mason bogie locomotive ever produced. And for them to have it delivered, there was no railroad from Salt Lake City south at the time that they were building the railroad out of American Fork up the canyon. So they leapfrogged that locomotive on a piece of track, I would say about 35 miles south from Salt Lake City, where it was delivered off of the Transcontinental, all the way down to American Fork, to the railhead. And it wasn't 5 or 6 years later that the Utah Central, or Utah Southern, excuse me, standard gauge railroad actually connected to that point. And that railroad was already running. It was a fully independent, non-connective route. And I mean, just to think to lay a piece of track, a piece of 30-foot track, just to leapfrog this locomotive all the way down is amazing to me.
Well, I got one that can top that, Adam. I got one
What's
that top that. I got one that
I'm sure.
top that. I've since moved to the South. I was lured down here by my girlfriend. Well, anyway, I met a lot of people from the South who are pretty good historians themselves. And one of the interesting things about narrow gauge is a lot of the people in the hobby and logging is that you have to be you don't have to be kind of a historian, but you end up being one in the hobby. And a guy from Alabama told me a story about true story, because he showed me the book, showed it to me in the book, was that there was some logging company that did that all across Alabama. They'd work this little section that they'd either purchased or got their logging rights off. Then they'd work out a deal to work another section, and they managed to crawl the entire railroad across to Alabama. True story. Without moving with the equipment always staying on the same rails. And it was, I don't know if it was standard gauge or narrow gauge, but that's how they ran the thing.
John had mentioned the danger of the logging operations. I mentioned in the introduction the Michigan-California Lumber Company. The reason they were finally shut down and put out of business was because they never went to the Janey-style coupler. They remained a link and pin operation into the 1950s, and finally the municipal governments closed the railroad. And this was a line that they had huge wire operations where they would send flat cars across these valleys on basically chain and rope and so forth, so that those type of dangers of logging railroading were still around well into the 1950s.
Somebody's asking this question. I tried to pop this up on here, but it was in the middle of someone talking. What do you guys think about narrow gauge operations? Like, is there one that you know of that you haven't seen somewhere in the world that you would like to go see, or is there one where you live or that you have seen that you think is really worthwhile?
I'll tell you where the hot spot is right now is Brazil. They're like restoring a locomotive every 3 to 6 months somewhere in Brazil, and most of it is meter gauge, which is 39 inches, and some beautiful stuff. And nearly all of it is American-made engines. A lot of Baldwin's. Baldwin had a good sales rep in Rio de Janeiro, sold a lot of locomotives, and they have little tiny Baldwin Pacifics 462s that are 3-cylinder, that are running, and plus meter gauge Malleys and all kinds of stuff, or meter gauge articulated, also built by Baldwin. I'd love to go and plus reviving a 2-foot gauge engines that have engines just like the Sandy River engines. in Maine. It's fascinating what's going on down there.
Someone was asking about Maine. I want to go through this
Yeah.
question if there's anybody else who wants to chime in on it, and then I'll put the Maine question back up. Go ahead. I think, was that you, Dave?
Yeah, I was just going to say, as far as, where to go see narrow gauge, there's a lot of it in the United States, including the guys back east are doing a great job of bringing back the 2-foot stuff, and that's one on my bucket list to get back there and see some of that. So otherwise, you've got Colorado, you've got narrow gauge in California, you've got the guys, the Carson, Colorado group that resurrected the SP-18. They're putting in some track at a museum down there, so you're going to be able to see steam down there periodically. There's just a lot of places, and it's worth getting out to see this stuff. Just simply because you look at it, it's cool. It gets your creative juices going again, and you want to go back home and build models. So, I mean, yeah, that's it. I like going to Colorado. I've probably been to Colorado, I guess, over the last 40 years, somewhere close to 30 times. So that's not quite once a year, but darn close. And I just never get tired of the scenery, and I never get tired of the railroads. The only bad news is that there isn't that much stuff to measure up to draw plans for anymore to build models of. It's everybody's pretty much got it all covered. So I get to spend more time rail fanning and less time doing architectural research.
Someone's train is whistling. I think John had his phone going.
John, I'll just hop in briefly and say that for people who are interested in more modern railroading, you've got some fascinating things going on in narrow gauge. In Plaster City, California, which is down near the Mexican border, to my knowledge, it's the last operating, not necessarily a common carrier, but industrial narrow gauge in America, and that's the U.S. Gypsum Company in Plaster City. But another very recent development that I think took several of us by surprise was the order and subsequent delivery of the new White Pass and Yukon diesels. The White Pass and Yukon is truly a tourist operation now. They're fed mainly by the cruise lines that come up to Alaska, and that's the pride of their operation as far as their business is concerned. But they just received brand new 6-axle diesels. So there's a lot of opportunity even in modern narrow gauge.
For sure. I was just up at Roaring Camp here a week ago. I think a week ago today, watching narrow gauge up at Roaring Camp. So it really is all over the place. One thing is you have to know what you're looking at too. I mean, 'cause I could imagine people who aren't really into trains might go to a place like Roaring Camp and not realize they're looking at 3-foot narrow gauge, So did you want to chime in, Doug, about a place you'd like to go somewhere in the world to see?
The one that's kind of always fascinated me, and I don't know a lot about it or even how much of it is still running, but the South African stuff with the Buyer Garretts and that is just always fascinated me.
I understand they have Garretts in Australia too, actually.
Do they? I'll go anywhere to see them.
Actually, they actually have some 30-inch gauge Buyer Garrett running down somewhere in New South Wales. At the Puffing Billy, that's where it is. They got everything. They got a Climax. They got all kinds of stuff.
One of our viewers in here volunteers at Puffing Billy. I was talking to him recently, and that's where I heard about the Garretts that are running in Australia from him. What about you, Adam? Did you want to chime in about that? Do you have any narrow gauge operations you're interested in seeing elsewhere?
Oh, I mean, as far as like out of the country, I've just barely started getting semi-interested in anything outside of the U.S.
What about inside the U.S.?
If I could go to any narrow gauge outfit inside the U.S. that I honestly didn't have any intention of ever going to, it would be the Wiscasset, the Waterville, and Farmington. And really? To me, what they've done out there is absolutely phenomenal. I mean, I probably wouldn't even fit on that equipment, but but I would give it hell. I would try my damnedest to get in on one of them locomotives and go to town. But just watching some of the videos that have come out of there is just phenomenal, man. I can't get enough of that stuff. It's just beautiful.
It's so worth going out there to see.
Yeah.
They really did a good job. You really get a feel for it. They got some beautiful coaches there. They have a beautiful Jackson and Sharp coach, made by the same company that made a lot of narrow gauge equipment in Colorado, and it's gorgeous. And the restorations are the top notch, just top notch. Very worth. The other thing that's coming up soon is a restoration is going on of the East Broad Top narrow gauge in central Pennsylvania, and that's a 3-foot gauge, pretty big inside frame, 282 engines, and and there's some talk that they're going to have. It ran for years as a 5-mile railroad, and they're talking about extending at least 10 to 15 miles somewhere. The south end of the railroad, which apparently they're working on, went through bridges and tunnels, and it's very scenic.
Yeah, someone had mentioned that in the chat as well about the East Broad Top. I'd heard about that too. That'd be interesting to see how that develops.
Yeah,
that's on the list of places to go next year.
Absolutely.
Someone else is asking. Somebody had mentioned about the Carson in Colorado being resurrected. Where is that happening?
I can speak a little bit to that.
Okay.
The Carson in Colorado group is a nonprofit that operates out of Independence, California, which is down in the Owens Valley of California. It's between Owens and Inyo County. And the Southern Pacific donated a 460 10-wheeler to Independence in 1954 when it was retired. And that's the number 18. And the group spent the better part of a decade getting the locomotive restored. And in 2017, they took it to Laws, California. Laws in modern times, I should say in the 1940s, 50s, and up to 1960, was the northern terminus of the Keeler branch of the Southern Pacific. And Laws is one of really 2 places of the grand old Southern Pacific where you can step back in time and it's exactly like it was when it was retired. One of those places is the machine shop, erecting shop that was built in the 1860s by the Central Pacific here in Sacramento. But the other one really is Laws. And so they took the locomotive to Laws and it operated. That was September of 2017, and they had a huge revival for that. And that really kicked off the revival of the Carson in Colorado, which then became the Southern Pacific. And they're still working down there. They're restoring some equipment. They were going to put some track back in service south of Laws, but I understand that project has been shelved for now, at least. But Southern Pacific narrow gauge fans can be proud that we have one of the 3 surviving steam engines restored.
Yeah, I remember I know some people that took a trip down to Laws when they ran the Slim Princess down there. I know it wasn't much of a run, but it was something, right? And it was something that we haven't seen probably in a long time.
Well, it very well could have been a once-in-a-lifetime thing for me. I went down that day. I took part in the night photo shoot that Railfan Railroad magazine put on. And it could be the only time that a locomotive ever goes to Laws. We're just not sure. The Laws Museum is more of a historical center than an operating tourist railroad. So they have different priorities, but to see that particular locomotive back on its home rails was a real thrill for us in California.
Yeah, I know it drew quite a crowd. I remember seeing videos of it too.
Absolutely.
So we had another comment that was from someone in Australia mentioning that the Garretts are there and they're operating. So
I guess I need to go to Australia.
You're going to have to go to Australia now.
They have a big standard gauge Garrett that they restored to operation. It goes at direct speed. It's pretty spectacular.
I
And
would
then they
bet.
and then they have that little narrow gauge one at Puffing Gully, which is real small. I think it's 04 or 40 plus 040 or something like that. I'm not sure. Another railroad I'd recommend real quickly is I understand that they have a 35, 40 miles of 3-foot gauge railroad running in Colombia as a tourist railroad, and it's very popular. They have low outside frame 282s that are basically K29s if you need to know, but they were and they have a outside frame mogul and an outside frame 480 running down there. So I'd love to go. And Colombia is supposed to be a beautiful country, one of the most beautiful countries in South America.
Yeah, we have another question. Someone's asking me to ask. I don't know anything about this, so maybe you guys can talk to this one. Why does it seem like main 2-footers are modeled less nowadays? I don't know anything about that. Is that something that one of you guys could talk to?
Well, yeah, I'll take a stab at it.
Okay.
It's hard saying what's up and what's down, and that's just simply because there really isn't anyone in the hobby that's doing surveys that are worth a darn on that. So as far as what's the population, what's the split, who's in, who's out, nobody's quite sure. I mean, Calmback runs some surveys every once in a while, and I've responded to a bunch of those, and that somehow got me on their list for their Lionel magazine. You know how that happened, I don't know, because that's not the way I answered anything. But that's it. On the other hand, as you take a look in places like the Short Line and Narrow Gauge Gazette, what you see is there are small manufacturers that are basically doing prototype stuff for main 2-foot gauge. There's resin kits, there's laser cut kits and things out there. There's other materials available, and so I think probably guys modeling the 2-foot stuff are doing fine. Out here in California, there's a gentleman that's building the entire Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes in 1/4-inch scale. So, and I've had the pleasure of seeing that, and that's going to be marvelous as that's coming along. It's just super. I know Scott knows about that one too. So, I would say this guy is certainly trying to keep a main 2-foot gauge modeling alive, and I know the individual that he bought a lot of the structures from as he moved back to doing Boston and Maine and HO scale this time after doing Boston and Maine and 1/4-inch scale. So the collections and things move around, and somebody will pick it up and keep doing something with it. So I don't know that there's been a lot of people dying out. I think it may be what most people are worried about, and that is, gee whiz, the hobby seems to be getting smaller, and there's fewer people building models. And again, I don't have any statistics on that either. That's just what all us old time guys yell about. But I don't know. I don't know if that's true, because there's a lot of guys that are active in this hobby, and all you got to do is look at YouTube to see that.
Well, I think there's an answer to that too, Dave. Is that I think we're in a transition time in the hobby. The hobby was dominated for many years of guys 15 to 20 years older than you and me.
Yeah.
And they're passing on. A lot of collections have come on the market and depressed the market for models, and people look at it and go, wow, this is, and there are older guys, but as one survey, I did see a survey, and they pointed out something interesting. Is people are interested in narrow gauge, probably get interested in it sometime in their 20s, not only narrow gauge but serious model railroading in general, and can't address it at the time because they can't afford it. Either they're working their way up in whatever business they're in, they're raising children, they're buying a house, they have the kind of expenses that preclude them getting in the hobby. And the majority of guys who get in the hobby start probably in their 40s or start finding the time to build stuff in the hobby are usually in their 40s, starting in their 40s. So the young guys are in the 40s. The median age in the hobby will always be somebody in their 50s.
I disagree with that, actually. I've
You're a kid.
yeah, well, and that's all fine and good. That's all fine and good. But as you know, in some of the other podcasts that I'm involved with, we've come to find out that there's a lot more people in our younger generations that are there. They're just not out there because they're at home. They're on their computer. They're doing a lot more of the social thing. Is like, I think you'd be really surprised at how many people there are in the younger years that are actually in the hobby. They're there. They're out there. They may not have the money. They may not have the space. They may not have a house, but they're there. They're doing things. They've reinvented the hobby into different things. Like, instead of building a massive layout, they're building smaller switching layouts. They're building, weathering's become a huge part of the hobby. That's, all sorts of little things that have branched off from, I'm building a massive model railroad in my basement. That's dying out, but it's still there for a lot of the older people that can do that. If we're still talking about main 2-footers or why people haven't done that, my opinion is it rolls right into this as well. The other part of the hobby that I think has really taken off is the ready to run right now available stuff. And the reason that people don't do the 2-foot gauge stuff is that takes a lot of effort. I mean, it's not something that you can't buy something and just take it out of the box, weather it up, make it look pretty, put it on the track and run it. In all reality, I think HON3, the reason that it blossomed the way it did was because of Blackstone. The reason that ON3 blossomed the way it did was because of San Juan, MMI, some of these companies that started producing these relatively affordable, ready to run models that you could just take out of the box and run. That opened up a massive door for people that wouldn't have never taken a box of sticks and glued them together and make a box car or something like that, And I bet you money, honestly, if somebody would put out Flex Track and ready to run models in 2-foot gauge, it'd take off. They'd do it.
I think you're hitting on an important point there, Adam. And one of them, and I'll elaborate on that, is that if you're interested in narrow gauge, if you have any interest in it, look at, the best place to start is ON30. You can still build a circle track, have 5 cars and a beautiful detailed model locomotive for under $600, and that means all of it. And that's just to get started. So you can start for. That'd be a great place to start. The models are beautiful. They usually have prototypes from either Brazil or Mexico, but or New Zealand. But the thing is, they're much cheaper and much more available. As Dave Falkenberg says, ready to run models with a gateway drug. Yes,
that's a fact. And
he's right.
And to follow what you're saying about ON30, Bachman hit a home run. We're talking grand slam with ON30 stuff because, with my company, Prospector Models, I've done more regaging of ON30 stuff into ON3 stuff than I ever thought that I would even. I couldn't believe it and once people realize that's possible, you can do that. Well, yeah. I mean, when we were talking about scale and gauge, when that correlation clicks, it's like, wait a minute, because they when they realize that an MMI K27 in ON30 isn't accurate. Well, some people are cool with that, but others are like, oh no, we're going to step it up to this. Honestly, ON30 was like one of the biggest home runs ever hit in model railroading, in my opinion.
A great place to start. If you want to look at something where you can get into it and not spend a pile of money like us fiends who buy these $2,000 grass models. You start with start with $400. Buy a locomotive and 2 cars and some track, and you can get going with this.
Right.
Right. Well, there's a couple points to add here about ON30. One, I agree with the point that was made that it took off really because they knew they needed to put out a train set. The train set is where a lot of people start. You get the transformer and the track, And the other great thing about ON30 as kind of this gateway drug, as one of the commenters said, was that you can take HO track and run on it.
Yeah.
Really important point.
It's a very
Really
important point because if you've got if you're an HO modeler in standard gauge and you're thinking about testing the waters with narrow gauge, it's overnight to get yourself an ON30, a locomotive that's very economical and it's ready to run, and you've just had your first introduction into narrow gauge.
I think the trick is don't invite any hardcore modelers over because they'll notice the track's the wrong scale.
Well, I could say something, but this is a family show about. Don't get guys like me, Adam, and Doug started about some particular characters, the high priests of the hobby.
The critics.
Oh no, the high priests. They are the alpha and omega of this, and that's what it is. And anybody interested in narrow gauge, ignore them. Have fun.
Well, one of the big points here is, if you're a standard gauge modeler in anything between HO and G, there are instant gratification options for you. We live in an instant gratification society. It's true. That's one of the reasons why the ready-to-run stuff is so popular and affordable. It's one of the reasons that the 3D printing has taken off, even in narrow gauge. Now, I agree, narrow gauge is one of the last bastions of craftsman modelers, simply because you have to be to get some of the things you want. But the options are available if you like instant gratification. If you don't have the time to build, you can still model in narrow gauge.
Mm-hmm.
Can I make one little point to follow that? What Scott's saying there is that I have a mantra, which is simply it's called close enough modeling. You don't have to count the rivets. Just make the model look close enough to narrow gauge to convince yourself.
I think that's a good point, John. That when someone is modeling, that's really the only person you need to impress is yourself, and make it something you like, because you're building it for yourself, right? I mean, I think that's lost on some people.
Well, the other thing, John, is no matter what you do or what you build, after a while you've surrounded yourself with a group of friends and you get to know each other real well. So when you roll out your latest model, you're going to take a ration of stuff no matter what. Right. I mean, you could have this thing down to the last thing, and one of these guys is going to find something and say, "Gee, Dave, didn't you know about this?" And then at that your point, you're going to say, no, I didn't. So you can add it? Nope, I'm done with that model. And you just said, I'm having fun with it. See, you want to move on to the next thing. You can't get too hung up on this. I think a good friend of mine that models in 1 to 22.4, and his stuff is gorgeous. He said, Dave, you really aren't building a miniature of the real thing. You're building a model, for God's sake. Get over it. And that was one of the things that's really helped me out. I'm still working on the railroad, still having fun, and when COVID-19 gets back, we'll start running timetable and train order again with a great group of guys.
You can go that far with modeling. You end up like my dad that ends up all his stuff they're beautiful models, absolutely phenomenal, but none of them are ever finished because he keeps on doing more research and more research and more research. And by God, it's like, I don't know how many he's getting ready to repaint his Jupiter in 119 again. It's like, but he's on top of his game when it comes to knowing what it's about. But I'll be damned if he doesn't have anything to actually really go play with. But that's the thing, I guess. That's him.
Well, if he's having fun, he's doing it right.
Yeah, and that's the thing.
It. Yeah.
You ought to hear those conversations between me and him. It's like, holy crap, dude! I blame every one of my problems in modeling on my dad because he's got me into this situation, and it's like I finally had to just say, okay, I don't even care anymore. This is enough. I can't have working glad hands in HON3, dude. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, John. There was a question that flashed by that talked about dead rail. And
Yes.
then specifically, it was talking about, okay, quarter-inch scale. It looks like here, if we're talking MMI. And does that work? And the answer is, yeah, it does. I know several guys that have done that, and they're quite happy with it. I would probably, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that myself, I wouldn't go dead rail because I like operation. And when I've got stuff plugged into PG&E, unless they're doing a power outage out here to save California from burning down, is I know I'm going to have power to locomotives when I need it. And some of our sessions will go, 4.5 hours on that. So what I worry about is batteries. Most of my friends, basically, they'll go out and they'll switch a train, they'll run things around, but they aren't, trying to run full-blown operating sessions. And it works great. On the other hand, I get to clean track, I get to clean wheels. You got all kinds of downside to live rail pickup. And these guys don't have to worry about that. And they just absolutely love it. They just swap out batteries, change things, and away it goes.
Well, I've got some observations about that, Dave, is because I know a guy named Keith Hayes in Denver has a beautiful Colorado and Southern narrow gauge layout in southeast Denver, and Keith went dead rail, and the stuff. The thing is, the stuff runs flawless, but it's kind of in the Model T stages. They're working in England. They're working out. I mean, the problem is changing out the batteries, which inevitably beats up the tender or wherever you have the battery stored. The other problem, but that problem is being worked on in England. The guy is trying to develop they have developed a way where you can walk a train onto a positive rail situation where it can recharge. And as you're running it around the layout, you could have these positive rail locations where the dead rail will recharge. So that's coming, but it's not available yet. So I'm big on dead rail. I don't like DCC because you have to have that track clean enough to eat a 3-course dinner off of, and it's and so contact with DCC. I'm not crazy about it. Yes, the operation stuff is beautiful when the train isn't stopping.
Yeah. Well, that's where you need to move up to the massive quarter-inch scale, John. It just grinds its way through the dirt, no problem.
I don't want electric dogs here. I'll settle for SM3. Okay. But
go ahead, John.
But it's you can't I think DCC is a flawed system. It's great. It's got all these bells and literally has all the bells and whistles, but it has the big problem I see is the contact, and also the installation is just almost over the top. And I know how to do the installation. I don't like it, and it's another thing that beats up a nice model when you're doing it. And plus especially if you're working with older models, do you really want to drill 16 holes in your tender so you can hear the speaker or all the weird stuff people do with speakers with those things? Hey, speaking of that, there's just quickly is that guys are starting. You can buy iPhone speakers and mount them in the top of the cab, and man, the sound is fabulous. Have you seen that, Dave?
I have. Yep. Yeah, and also let's see, not this quarter-inch standard gauge. A gentleman now has got all his stacks drilled out, and he's got a speaker in a smoke box that's firing up to the stack. And I tell you, going in and out of a tunnel, that really works. It's don't have to look. Yeah, it's just great.
Yeah, that's where all my speakers are.
Oh, in your smoke box?
Yeah, even right down to HON3 C16s. They're all in my smoke box.
That's a cool option.
Yeah.
There's even a guy now, he has a company, you can probably Google it to find what the name of it is, but he's making 3D printed speakers that are the curvature of a steam locomotive boiler in several different sizes.
Mm-hmm.
That's the baffle box, and you can mount it right in there, and
that's That's my good buddy. That's my good buddy JT Brooks. His company's called Scale Sound.
Scale Sound. That's it. Thank you, Adam.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty cool. I hadn't heard about that. That's really good for Steam guys.
Yeah,
I've got some of his stuff right here. He's done a lot of stuff for me.
There you go.
But yeah, before I hooked up with him, I was taking those. I was doing kind of the same thing and just building my own little baffle that would fit into the smoke box with what I would call a sugar cube. He hates calling them that, but what we call sugar cube speakers. But he actually manufactures or has manufactured his own speaker. He's a sound engineer by trade, so he knows what he's doing, and it's amazing. I've got, if you go on my website or Facebook page, Prospector Models, there's quite a few videos of some installations I've done with his speakers, and they're phenomenal sounding, absolutely phenomenal.
I agree. I've installed a couple of them in some of my locomotives, including some geared shays and stuff, and they're just absolutely outstanding.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a question. The actual enclosure is the curved part, right? Because you can't make a curved speaker, right?
Right.
No, it's the baffle box.
Okay.
So it's like a half moon shape. So it slides right down to the bottom of your well, look, I think, give me a second. No.
Yeah. If you have one, Adam, please share. This is cool.
I had him make me one for my for one of my 1 to 20.
While he's looking for that, I'll just jump in real fast because I've been in DCC now, 20 years exactly, and basically, we had a discussion about dead rail, but the other thing that has kind of revolutionized at least narrow gauge modeling in the smaller scales because of this weight to contact relationship that can be less reliable than desirable, is the keep alives. And
exactly.
the keep alives that have come out, and maybe Doug, he's got a beautiful SN3 layout there. If he wants to talk more about that, that'd be great, because some of the narrow gauge models simply don't have the weight that we need for contacts unless you have something like those keep alives. So I'll let him talk to that.
Yeah, right. Particularly even in S scale, what a keep alive will do for an RGS goose like this one behind me here is incredible. It'll change it from one you don't want to operate very often to one that you want to operate all the time. And even I put one in a 278 PBL C16, and long story short, I put it in and it didn't work, and Adam made it work for me, but it made such a difference in that locomotive.
No, it makes a big difference.
Yeah, and I'm actually looking at a C19 right now. I've got a part on the desk, putting another one in there. It's changed everything. As you can, with the right keep alives, you don't even have to power the frogs if you really don't want to.
True.
It'll carry a locomotive across the frog as long as it's not too long.
I think we all know what keep alives are, but you want to explain that for the people who are watching?
They are a bunch of capacitors in a line, and they store the and little capacitors are like transformers in a big power plant. Is that they store power for a few seconds. So if you run over a dead spot, or the engine decides to go dead for some inexplicable reason, the engine keeps running until it comes to a live spot again. It has enough to power the model for about 4 or 5 seconds, and that's enough to get over a lot of bad track.
Yeah.
Right, and then it'll charge up again once it gets current again. It'll charge it back up for the next dead spot.
Right.
So,
one of the things is, you can get all kinds of fixtures to make these juice these frog juicers and stuff from Tamalpais models, but another trick is to juice the rear truck on your tender, and you don't need a frog juicer. Think about it. Anyway, One thing we should talk about is real quickly is that it's the hobby's divided pretty much between the Colorado narrow gauge, which is the elephant in the room, and the California narrow gauges like the West Side Lumber and the Southern Pacific narrow gauge. And unfortunately, there's cheap models in the model in California narrow gauge are kind of hard, are not really available.
They simply don't exist.
Right, they don't exist. That's for the advanced modelers. So again, us guys been in the hobby a long time. If we're coming in the hobby now, we'd all be buying 0-30 to get going. And just because it looks fun, make up your own imaginary freelance railroad, the chug water and western or whatever you want to do, and model something fascinating like either logging or mining, a mining railroad or something like that that so many narrow gauge railroads serve.
Looked like Adam had found that enclosure.
Yeah, let's see it, Adam.
So there's a. Granted, this one's. There's the speaker. Oh, there it is.
Yeah.
There's the speaker.
Speaker in there.
Yeah, and God, there we go. There we go.
Perfect.
But this is for a 1-20 scale K28, so it's pretty good size. But it's the same idea all the way down to the small stuff. But
Highly
even
recommended.
that, oh man, best money you can. I mean, it's hard because when you're looking, you can buy an iPhone speaker for $1 off eBay, But I used iPhone speakers for about 3 months because it was really, really cool. They were really, really cheap and they sounded pretty good, but there's better. There really is better, and you're going to pay for it, but it's worth it to me.
Well, the iPhones will you have to really look at what your decoder's putting out, because the iPhones will blow up if you have a hot decoder. So like for bigger locomotives, so check out how many amps that thing your locomotive motor and decoder drawing, because they will blow up those little iPhone speakers. True story.
Well, you're not looking. Well, I would say that it was probably wired wrong, because you really only have, with speakers, you have 4 ohms or 8 ohms, and you just got to kind of watch what your decoder is putting out. And as long as you're in correlation with that, and in all reality, if you're overrated, you can just add another speaker, which will drop it down to where you need to be. But it's not. I haven't ever actually blown out a speaker unless I wired it completely wrong, and I haven't drank that much while I've been working. So, especially on customer projects, but I've. Not saying that I haven't blown a decoder or two, but
are you saying that you only drink on your own projects, or you just don't drink as much on the customer projects?
Well, it depends on what stage the project's in. But I've got, just for example, I've got lined up right here. I don't know how many locomotives going.
Wow.
For people right now. It's like I don't know if it was a blessing or a curse to start offering services to the public, but it's been fun. And I like doing it. So, but anyway, what's that?
And you're good at it, Adam. So that matters.
I try. But yeah, it's fun. But when it comes to speakers though, it's one of those things. If you've got a nice locomotive and you're already invested at least $100 into a sound decoder, $15, $20 for a speaker isn't going to kill you. Why cheap out on $1 speaker when you got $100 sound decoder? I don't. And every time I've ever said that to anybody, they're like, "Yeah, you're right. You're probably right." And I'm like, "Oh, I know. Trust me. When I show you the difference, you'll really know." I'm not saying that an iPhone speaker doesn't sound good, because they sound pretty good for what they are, but they can sound a lot better.
Well, the other thing I'll just jump in and say is that if you have the room, take advantage of it and put in a speaker that has a better bass range, because so many of these smaller speakers, you just get the top end of the scale range. As you know, if you stand next to a locomotive, whether it's narrow or standard gauge, you've got all kinds of sounds, and your air pumps are very bass oriented. So if you have the room, take advantage of it and don't skip on the speaker.
Well, a lot of the problem that people have with the iPhone speaker is they think that it's like the iPhone speaker in general is a great speaker as long as you do not cut the baffle down. You got to remember that thing was engineered to do the max performance that speaker could do by Apple. I mean, it's a pretty high-end company, you know. But the minute a lot of people will start cutting that baffle down to get it to fit into a different place, into smaller spaces, and right there they ruin the entire integrity of that speaker, you know. And it's not the speaker that's necessarily sounding good; it's the baffle that's making the speaker sound good. So you got to remember that.
There's a comment from Dave Falkenberg, who would actually know about this stuff because yeah, he might know something about that, having worked on the iPhones. But he says there's all kinds of tricks that are used in the phones actually to make them louder too, and that doesn't surprise me.
Right.
Well, in actuality, when you think about it, is you want to adjust those things to if you're standing like a foot and a half away from your model, and you're modeling ON3 or SN3 or something like that, you're actually 150, 200 feet away. So model your sound to sound like what it would sound like from 150, not like it's going right by you or something like that. Because if you're standing if you get real close to the model, like a foot, like 6 inches away, and it's going by, you'll hear it just fine. But you don't have to make it some guys I think make them too loud when they're or louder than they should be, but that's just my opinion. Hey, do it the way you want. Yes,
it's a great opinion, though.
That's what I agree with you, John. That's what I've noticed here on the railroad. Here, when we have 4 or 5 or 6 trains running, it's almost too much. And to me, you know, you build an empire here that you imagine goes a long ways, and I'm standing on one side of the room and I can hear a train running that's supposed to be 100 miles away. So it's from that point, it's kind of distracted. And I really think that I haven't done it yet, but I really think that's what's going to be necessary when we really get back into operations, is to go back in and turn the volume down on a lot of these to where they're just not as loud.
One of the things that you and I, as narrow gauge railroaders, I forgot to mention, I worked 30 years on the Cumbres and Toltec and Durango and Silverton as an engineer and a fireman. Is that you know, I was used to hearing this stuff right close in, but then I also remember that when I was rail fanning, and I did a lot of rail fanning, even when I was railroading there, was that you know, it sounded entirely different. What would really be cool is somehow to figure out how to get reverb so you can get that sound of echoing, you know, that beautiful sound of echoing in those canyons. You know what I'm talking about, Doug?
Right. Right. Or even in a cut.
Or in a cut, yeah. I mean, but or just anywhere, even in the valley, is you'd get a little bit of reverb or echo, even in the Animas Valley with that stuff, or in the, you know, on the way up to Cumbres. But I see that sometimes the guys have all turned up. Wow, doesn't the sound fabulous? And I go, a little loud, man. And they go, yeah, you feel like you're right there. And I go, well, it's like the dude would say, that's just your opinion, man. You know,
yeah.
The
good thing, John, is you listen to it so long, you probably can't hear that anymore.
What? Yeah. Wait, I didn't hear that. You know,
you've listened to it from the cab for so long, you probably can't hear half of them sounds anymore.
Well, as a matter of fact, you know, one of the things that suck about geezerdom is the partial loss of my hearing. You know, and when you're watching Netflix with closed captioning, you know you're done as far as
I was thinking that it would be kind of cool, talking about volume and feeling like you're there or whatever, to have some kind of a Bluetooth connection inside a decoder that goes into some headphones, so each operator could hear his own train and maybe the radio chatter if you're doing some kind of a radio dispatch deal. And that way you don't have to worry about the guy that's 100 miles away in the other town he can hear his, you can hear yours. You know what I mean? I don't know I have no idea what it would take to do that, but it would be kind of cool.
Well, it sounds cool, but on the other hand, if you're running a group operation, and actually we have one here in Georgia, a guy mulls from Chama to Alamosa, and we sometimes have as many as 3 trains on there. It's good to hear where that other train is, because you're going by, your dispatching is strictly going by sound and eyeball, So, but I tried to dispatch one time. This is funny. I tried to do dispatching on a model railroad, and people were laughing at me. And it ended up with one guy who didn't know much about model or railroad practice. Just didn't even check, and almost had a head on with another. Like an Addams Family head on with another model. and then I said, okay, everybody out of the pool, and everybody going, you thought you could dispatch this thing? And I go, yeah, well, this is the last time I'm going to do it, because you guys don't know what to do.
One of the best sessions we had here was actually during the N-Scale convention when it was in Salt Lake. And Adam, of course, being a conductor, brought his friend Clem, who was an engineer. And those 2 guys ran the railroad while I visited with the people that come to see it. It ran flawlessly. You just have to hire professionals. That's all.
Right. Well, what we did at Phil Stead's beautiful 0-3 layout in north of here, 20 miles in ball ground, is we would have these open houses, and I had 3 guys I really trusted, and one of the best operators was this old trucker who started drinking at lunch, and so he was half lit all the time. Never missed a sighting. Never got in trouble out there, and then some goofball would come in there who never had a drink in his life, and he couldn't do it. It was fun, but it just depends on people who have a sense of how transportation work. Always make good model railroaders. Really
what Doug didn't say is right next to his railroad room, he has a full-on bar.
Oh yeah.
That might help a little bit.
Yeah, I bellied up to that bar a couple times too.
At least it keeps the operators coming back.
Yeah.
Hey, you got to throw something at them, or some red meat, or something to get them to come back.
I have a question from a while back during our discussion that someone was concerned that maybe narrow gauge is less stable because of the wheelbase and the width of the wheels that the rolling stock and locomotives and all that are sitting on. I'm thinking maybe they don't quite get the proportion is a little different too. Anybody want to speak to that?
Go ahead.
I would say that's probably a falsehood. Because you have the same coefficients in size and weight as you do in standard gauge. Now, we could get really technical with this question and talk about adhesion and all types of different things that would be less than in standard gauge because of weight and so forth. But when you're talking about proportionality, it's the same. And even the main 2-footers, they did not have a great deal of derailments or any issues. So no, I would say that's not entirely correct.
I think we could go back to the beginning of this conversation when Dave was holding the 2 cars up next to each other, and you could tell that one of them was obviously smaller proportionally than the other, even though they were the same scale. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Scott.
There was a problem in the prototype. Yes, there was a slight issue. Is inside frame locomotives could be top heavy, and some of them were so bad, like the 3 Florence and Cripple Creek 10-wheelers that the Rio Grande Southern had 20, 22, and 25, and the SB 22, SB narrow gauge 22, is that guys were a little afraid of them for a couple reasons. First of all, they're called deckless locomotives, where the boiler went all the way through the cab. And engineers were always scared to death, or engine men were always scared to death of being pinned in those cabs and burning to death, being scalded to death with hot steam. There's stories of guys begging to be shot to death because they couldn't be pulled out. But the deal is, so some guys were really scared of those inside frame locomotives, but the outside frame narrow gauge engines, we sandblasted 481 one time, and on the beading around the cab on the engineer's side said Baldwin Locomotive Works, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. That engine had never turned over, and it's partly because the engine had a low center of gravity. It was properly balanced. These builders were smart. Especially Baldwin, they knew exactly what kind of punishment that stuff was going to go through, and they designed that stuff for it. And so, as far as the modeling, yeah, models will flip over if your track sucks. Spend a little time on your track, even if you're an 0-30. Make sure that track is nice and smooth, especially around those sidings.
You don't want too much super elevation, then, huh?
I'm going to comment on this as far as narrow gauge goes. For several decades, I was involved with 5-inch scale, 15-inch gauge. And again, it was proportioned after Colorado and SP stuff. And it was a sort of a thing where you basically you could sit two butts side by side in the car. You could lean, you could tip. These things did not derail if you had your track on the car was set up right. So there really wasn't much of a problem there. On the other hand, you start going back down to where you've got 7.5-inch gauge. That gets a little dicier because your average human butt sitting on one of these cars here, which is why the Ryder cars, they try and have a low center of gravity, your feet on the outboard so you can kind of stabilize the thing. But yeah, you can see what happens when you start to exceed the rational width limits of some of these things here. Yeah, you are going to get side to side tip over problems on that. And that's, one of the items you
direct correlation with what you just said is I model narrow gauge in 7.5-inch gauge.
Okay. Yeah.
Which makes it 2.5-inch scale.
Right.
And you're correct. 7.5-inch gauge, standard gauge being 1.5-inch scale, very unstable for me. I'm 300 pounds, 6'3". But narrow gauge, 2.5-inch scale, same gauge, very stable, very stable. So that right there could prove the entire thing on the stability of the narrow gauge.
Yeah.
It's the same gauge. The equipment's just built to actually utilize the full your adhesion, everything, all the scientific stuff, and it works.
Right. I would add to that, Adam, is that Kevin Doe, who lives here in Georgia, been kind enough to let me run his 7.5-inch gauge K27 and his 7.5-inch gauge 361, and the K27. Having ridden in the 463 as an engineer, I was amazed how much it rode just like the 463 in person. 7.5-inch. They get that heavy, they start picking up the attributes of the prototype. And what was cool about running around the 361 after running the 463, I go, hey, this is what the real 361 felt like when you're going down the track.
Right.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it was.
Fun.
I was blessed that I've had a chance to run all kinds of stuff, everything from 7.5-inch gauge engines to standard gauge 10 wheelers. But that was really illuminating to see that when they got heavy enough, they actually picked up the attributes of the prototype. It's a fascinating hobby and or fascinating corner of the hobby. And if you're interested in it, now tell people who are new to this deal, is don't let the idea that it's the advanced end of the hobby scare you off. You need to start somewhere. Start with something that you like, even H1-3 or something, and do that. And the answer. One last thing is to answer Falkenberg's question about. He mentioned something about end scale models. Is that I would look into the mini NAMIs that Soundtrax offers that are that can work in something as small as N scale, and they offer cube speakers, and there's other mini speakers like Adam was showing that can work in N scale.
I think Tsunami has the TSU 1100 that'll fit in a lot of N scale stuff.
Yeah, it's great. It'll fit in. It's almost made for HO3, and it will definitely. If HO3 is very similar to N as far as size, and you could probably, if you're enterprising, you can get it in there. The only thing is, I would say this about all the scales is the diesel models operate far better than the steam models. They just plain do. And what they're doing with the HO models as far as ready to run DCC models is superlative. Excellent.
John, I know we only have a few minutes left here, unless we run long, but I think we should probably do a service to those people who are interested in getting into narrow gauge and tell them about some of the resources we have.
I think that's a great idea, Scott. And I was going to mention that I saw that we're at about an hour and 25 minutes right now. I'm okay with. Here's the thing, though, and I told you guys this would happen. As soon as we start getting going, it's like, oh, it's time to stop already. I'm okay with going. Yeah, I'm okay with going longer if you guys want to. If you have more to say, I'm totally okay with that. But I do think that's a great idea, Scott. And then,
well, let's just cover that briefly, and then we can go back to some of the other topics. But I think if you're interested in narrow gauge, especially if you're getting into modeling, or if you have been interested in narrow gauge and you have not yet subscribed, the Narrow Gauge and Shortline Gazette magazine truly, not only is it a standard for those of us who are interested in modeling and interested in prototype history of narrow gauges in North America, but it's an outstanding magazine in general. Its content for decades has been excellent. One thing we didn't have a chance to touch much on is John and his skilled artistry and his paintings, but many of those magazines feature John's artwork on the cover, and I love seeing them come every quarter. It's a quarterly magazine, or every 2 months. Every 2 months. It's every 2 months, bi-monthly magazine. It's not quarterly, but I would suggest you subscribe. It's a great resource. And then there's all kinds of Facebook groups for narrow gauge modeling. Those are great resources. There's narrow gauge groups on Groups.io. So take advantage of some of that stuff and enjoy the narrow gauge that's available out there. It's a great time to be a narrow gauge hobbyist.
Well, I would second that. There's no better go-to source for information on narrow gauge and narrow gauge and Shortline Gazette. You get a full picture of it because partly because the editor, Bob Brown, a great guy, has always tolerated us DNRG narrow gauge modelers, but he's also very big in the California narrow gauge, which is and also anything else industrial and all any possible thing that you could possibly model. And there's so many resources. The best places to look for resources are for ON30 and HON3, and there's just everything there. ON3 is very good, and so is SN3. But if you're looking to start, look at HON3 and ON30. And the best place to start your search or start your interest is a subscription narrow gauge and Shortline Gazette.
Yeah, the good thing about that is most of the prominent narrow gauge manufacturers advertise in that. And by all means, go to their website. Most of them have websites that you can go to, and you go to one website and you'll find yourself at a dozen of them before you're done. So I agree with everybody else. That's a great place to start.
Yeah, thanks for that, Scott.
Yeah, John, I'm just going to answer the weather report up at Corumba that flashed across the screen. And the answer to that is the clouds are gathering, but no snow yet up at Corumba.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys saw that. Carumbas, for people that haven't seen Dave's layout, it's on his layout.
It's the top of the hill, top of the 4%.
Yeah. It's
Kind
the
of like
summit, right?
Coombeach, right? Yeah.
Basically, I couldn't model Coombers. It didn't fit. So the buildings are all up there. The Y is up there, but it just isn't the same arrangement. So the only thing I could do was call it Carumba.
Works for me.
Yep.
Something else
Well-
that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, John.
I was going to say something else that we didn't talk about that I thought would come up, but it didn't, was FN3. Because, people think G scale, and they think everything that's in outdoors in a garden is G scale, and it's not really. And I know Adam knows about this because I'm pretty sure his garden layout that he has or had was modeled in 1 to 20.3, which is FN3.
There you go.
Hey, do you?
Is that one right there?
Yep, there's an FN3 San Juan coach.
I just
Is
have
that
one
AMS
question.
models?
What's that?
Is that AMS models?
AccuCraft.
AccuCraft.
Yeah, this is brass.
Oh, great.
Looks like a pretty model.
Yeah, they're nice.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to get hit in the head with one of those, but
No, this thing weighs probably, I bet you this thing's 23 pounds.
the one question I have for you, Adam, is do you have a dance hall where you can run that stuff?
No, but I got 3/4 of an acre.
Hey, now that's dead rail, right? That is your dead. That would be dead
Yeah,
rail, right?
I run that all dead rail. I use the where did I put it? It was out here a second ago. Oh, I use AirWire, and which is cool about AirWire is it's battery operated, but it's also DCC. So I use the TCS Wow Sounds and Tsunami decoders, the 5-amp ones, and everybody's battery, this and the battery. I can do battery with command control. I can do everything that you can do on your normal DCC system, just all battery.
Yeah.
It's pretty fun.
We got a question from Theodore Kruper about standards for modular layouts in ON3. Maybe Dave Adams could answer that. Is there any are there any standards for modular layouts in ON3, and where would one find them? And do you know anybody doing modules?
So unfortunately, I'm not going to be a good guy to answer the question. The modular groups around here, there was one that was ON3, and they basically developed their own standards for that module that were incompatible with anything else. Then you've got the several ON30 groups, Yosemite Valley Short Lines, and again, they developed a modular, or I'm going to say it's a sectional railroad is what it is on that. It's because the modules really aren't interchangeable. On that for the most part. Otherwise, I know that and this is probably going back 30 years, there was an attempt to standardize on modules for ON3. And I don't know if that actually got adopted or got off the ground. And I haven't looked at the MNRA specifications for this stuff or practices for so long. I just don't know. But if there were a standard for it, I would check the MNRA standards or recommended practices first.
Okay, that's a good.
I would
answer.
think that someone could easily come up with an ON3, like ON3 Fremo or something, where the one track has to be a specific distance from the edge or whatever. Sounds like it couldn't be too hard, but I'm not aware of a standard that's going on right now either.
There are SN3 standards, John. I have a list of SN3 standards, but I haven't seen one for ON3.
I haven't seen one for ON3 either.
Have you seen one for HON3, Scott?
Oh yeah, I think the NMRA's got it.
Yeah.
For HON3 modulars?
Yeah.
Pretty sure.
Yeah.
Cool.
I know there's one for SN3. I got it. all in three. I think you could contact the NMRA, and if you're not a member of the NMRA, join. Is what I'd tell everybody listening. That's another good organization because it's a go-to organization for this kind of information.
And the NMRA also produces standard gauges or standards gauges for all the narrow gauge scales, at least that I'm aware of.
I think they have them for all scales, don't they? I've seen garden scale standards gauges. I've seen HO. I've seen NO. I think I've seen all of them. Yeah, that's one of the great.
The only one I haven't. I've known two guys who model O&2. We were talking about that earlier, and they have to. There's some go-to guy who makes O&2 standards gauges, but I don't think the NMRA offers them. I don't know that, but I know I have SM3 ones. I have two of them. NMRA.
It's one of the great things that the NMRA did for the industry. Really, was coming up with the standards that they came up with. I often find myself telling people who are considering joining, but not convinced that if it weren't for the NMRA, your Atlas models wouldn't work on your Kato track or any combination you want to make that way.
Try to imagine what DCC would be like if the NMRA didn't step in early and demand standards from those manufacturers. Please think about that.
Yeah.
It wouldn't work. Everybody would have their own, and they would all claim it's better than everybody else's. And if you bought one brand, you'd have to buy all the same brand. It would be a mess.
Right. And then hope they didn't go out of business.
Right.
You have a little sneak peek into what that looks like if you're a 10-plate modeler.
Yeah.
It's true. You might even call it pay and pray.
Right.
Well, isn't that what this whole? I mean, what's great about it is it's partly because of NMRA and partly because a few manufacturers single-handedly brought up the standards. I think. I mean, people would debate this with me, but PVL, I think, almost single-handedly brought up the standards of narrow gauge modeling, in my personal opinion, in several ways. But I think generally the people who are still in business, and that's another thing, is if you buy Bachmann or any of these other companies have been around for a while, you know what you're getting. That doesn't mean a new company is bad. It just means that there's some companies that have really maintained some good standards over the years for their products, and those are the go-to guys.
Yeah, that's always a good place to start. And then once you get your feet wet, you can move on to some of the more specialized stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the part of the deal is you have to, if you stay in a hobby long enough, you're going to end up being a pretty good shade tree mechanic with your models. There'll be some stuff you can't fix, and you'll have to send it to some specialist. But generally, you end up being able to do some pretty heavy repairs on them. And the weird thing about I started modeling when I worked on the DNS-NG back around 1980. I started building models at home, and when I wasn't working on the narrow gauge, and the weird thing about being in a hobby for 40 years is you end up rebuilding models that you built 40 years ago. That's one of the crazy. I don't know if you've gone through any of that, any of you, but I have. Maybe Doug has. I don't know.
Yeah, I've got some of them. Some of them that really need done too.
How about you, Dave? Have you rebuilt old models that you did years ago?
Yeah, I have on that, and I, looking at that, and just to change the standard gauge for a minute, that's Jack Burgess. He comes up with more. He says his layout's been done for the last 10 years, and he gets more information on a structure, takes a look at it, says, "Gee, I built that wrong. I'm going to have to build a replacement better than that one there because I've got newer information." So, yeah, there's another railroad that's been done for years, but is being renewed as Jack gets more information and becomes dissatisfied with what he's done. Yeah, right now I've got a locomotive that has got a head for the back shop just simply because it's worn out. When Charlie Trombley told me that years ago that you were going to wear out locomotives if you operated a lot and you stayed in the hobby forever, yeah, I didn't believe him, but he was right. I mean, that's it. You start looking at that, and the side rods have got too much slop, and the driver axle bearings are now sort of oval egg shape, and things hop around, and I've almost got the two blind center drivers touching as they kind of oscillate back and forth. So yeah, I've got another brass project here sometime when I get ambitious.
I met a guy in Loveland, Colorado, had had a, had a big enough standard gauge model railroad that it was a freelance model railroad of imaginary main line that ran from Denver to Seattle, diagonally across the Northwest. Well, it was a long model railroad, and he had, it was all diesel when I went there, and I said, "Hey, did you ever do steam?" He said, "I started out with steam, and I actually wore out every one of the models except one, and that's a fan. That's a locomotive the railroad runs for the fans,
Yeah,
but he ended up selling all that stuff at Caboose Hobbies. He said every one of them had wore out pins and wore out
yes,
and sharp flanges and
yeah,
basically all they did was just hop off the track all the time. We said when they got old. So
yeah.
that's something to think about. Is if you have a favorite model, be sure you have extra parts.
Parts.
Yeah.
Well, maybe one of the things we should talk about, I know we mentioned it before we went live, but some real recent news is that Rio Grande Models has announced they're going to make a comeback, which is great for everybody that's between
Yep.
HON3 and ON3. They make some great metal kits. And they're perfect starter kits for people who are just getting into the hobby. They're easy to put together. They paint well, and they're great
Yeah.
models. They run. There's a reason that they've been around so long. I don't think any of us on the panel are quite sure who has purchased the company from Eric Brocker, but it's great to know that the tradition of Rio Grande models will continue for us. It's an important piece of narrow gauge in the hobby.
I,
Yeah.
I would I would say something to people buying up these older companies and stuff, and I'm so glad that they are because Eric put out so many wonderful parts and many unique
Kits.
kits.
Yeah.
But one of the things I would point out is if you acquire if you're acquiring that sort of stuff, if you buy a company like that that's making pot metal. Um, 3 foot 7 arch bars that the Rio Grande used. Don't bother. I mean, there's a lot of parts that you need to look at these parts line and make informed decisions about what you'll continue and what you won't. I'm just saying that from a businessman's point of view. Is that and I've talked to other guys who are in the business and they say, yeah, that's good advice. Some of the, like why make an SN3 DNRGW arch bar when PBL makes the best one you can buy, for maybe a buck or two more than your stuff. So it's I think people I think you run into that with a lot of these companies is that some of these older companies have a lot of stuff that should be discontinued, but if you have unique stuff that's one of a kind, and you're the only guy that's going to offer it, by all means keep making that stuff. It'd be tough, but I love seeing this stuff and I being bought up and taken over. They're great cottage industries for your family and stuff like that. And the most important thing to say here is there's a bunch of little companies like that, like Trout Creek Models, that make stuff in HON3, 201, SN3, and ON3, and these parts are and they're one of a kind parts. So, these are parts for the advanced modeler. This is something, if you're just getting in a hobby, don't worry about this stuff. But down the road, if you're an advanced modeler and you're watching this, support these small companies, these small mom and pops that are putting out these parts that you couldn't ever possibly get anywhere else. It's really important to support the small business people in this hobby, in our wonderful hobby.
The only real alternative to that is you're going to have to design and probably 3D print your own later if these places go out of business, right? And that in itself could be a big pain in, well, you know what, because 3D design is not the simplest thing to learn.
Right.
And you kind of need to know that if you're going to design your own printable stuff.
The problem with 3D is John, how do you print a pair of trucks? Is that plastic going to be tough enough to handle trucks? Because trucks, believe it or not, even model trucks are heavy duty products for the thing. Somebody's asking, Bill Grierson's asking, has anybody updated any information on Crystal River products? No, all we've heard is that Crystal River products, another fine line of models. I mean, beautifully designed models has been sold. And remember something when you hear that something has been sold, is I know this because I know the team that bought San Juan Car, which makes O-Tree and also Grant Line parts. Is they spent months and months just sorting out all, basically a pile of stuff, a pile of molds, parts, and trying to classify them. And if somebody announces that they start a business, give them 6 months to put the whole thing together, maybe even a year, because it takes a while to get these, buy an old company and reconstitute it.
Yeah, John, I was going to chime in here and say the father and son team that bought Crystal River from Tom Fitzgerald, they were at the Sacramento convention on that, and they had several of their kits available there, the smaller ones, and they did say they had a real steep learning curve on trying to figure out how to actually get good laser cuts and things of this sort. So they said this has been a lot harder to do than they thought it was, but they thought they were going to try and keep at it because they did want to bring the kit line back. So I haven't heard much from them. I'm supposedly on their mailing list and really haven't seen anything. But like I said, they were, as of last September, they were still alive and had something to offer. I wish them success because those kits that Tom put out were just absolutely fantastic.
Just to add to that, Dave, I did get an email from them probably a month or two ago that said that they had some of the HON3 kits available now.
Okay, so, great.
And I can't remember which ones they were. What I was kind of looking for was the section house that they made in SN3, but
I wish I bought that.
That wasn't one of them.
Yeah.
But they did say they were working on that. So I think they're still around and still trying to make a go of it. So I'm kind of hoping to get to know. I know one of the son of the team doesn't actually live too far from me, last I heard. So I'm kind of hoping to maybe meet him sometime and really find out what's going on with them. Because I like you, I love their kits. I think the water tank that I built of theirs is probably the best water tank I ever built.
Yeah.
It's really good.
Yeah, if they could bring that back and then carry on in the tradition of Tom, that would be great. I mean, Tom was a guy that was interested in prototype, and if you called up and say, well, I'm doing a Chama tank, Tom, and I'm going to need to have a second gallows and a few other things on that. Would you sell those to me? And he said, yeah, Dave, I'll do that, whatever it is. Said, and did you know the posts on the Chama tank were a different length than on the other narrow gauge tanks? And I said, well, I hadn't measured them. He said, okay, good, I'll cut your posts to size too. So all of a sudden, here you get this custom kit just from talking to him on what it was, and that's what I built for Chama, and then got a couple of motors running spouts up and down, and it works fantastic.
Yeah,
but
that's great.
The kits go together and everything fits. I mean, that's the amazing part. Tom just engineered this stuff. It's yeah, like Rags is another top tier laser kit producer.
What somebody I think his name Dave Nolan, but he had a statement that he'd done some. Paul Nolan said that he printed some 3D trucks and for his F&3 layout, and they work perfectly. So I guess the quality of the plastic's better than I may have thought. So I just noting what Paul Nolan said there.
I'd like to add on that 3D stuff though. With the trucks, I'm interested to see in their longevity, how long they last, because we all know that there's friction, there's wear, even in metal parts. Wear is an issue. Just knowing about 3D printing, I think some of the older materials probably wouldn't have lasted very long. With the new resin printing, I think you have a better opportunity or a better probability of them lasting a bit longer. But then with FN3 is interesting because I'd say most layouts are outdoors, and that adds another element to it called the sun. The UV light has such an amazing effect on plastics and other materials that I would be skeptical on some of the 3D printed stuff right now to invest a bunch into it. But that's just based on a few things that I've experimented on in outdoor and large scale parts.
Yeah, I can speak to Paul's comment a little bit because I know what he's talking about. They have log cars that they had the trucks printed for, and it is an outdoor layout. But to your point though, Adam, I don't think they've had them a really long time yet.
Yeah, I'd just like to see the length of time that they actually will last, because I can see that UV light just pounding on them, and then just added weight with with the F scale stuff and everything else. I'm really interested to see how long that lasts.
I'll keep that in mind and ask them eventually when they do break, and I'll let you know.
Right.
So. Hey, it all breaks. You're running something. If one piece of metal's hitting another, it's going to break.
Oh, it's going to. That's the thing about all of this is you're modeling a railroad. A railroad needs a real full-size railroad needs as much maintenance as anything else, and there's no shame in having to have maintenance on this stuff either. Yeah. It's one of those things that plan on replacement parts, plan on maintenance, plan on all that stuff. It doesn't matter what scale gauge you're modeling in. Just plan on it. It's going to be one of them things. It's all mechanical.
One thing I'd point out is something that came up recently for me was I have this SN3 RGS 40, and I love that old model because it had the mismatched domes and a big old box headlight right up until they crashed it, and there was a favorite on the Rio Grande Southern. Well, I wore that thing out. I burned up the gearbox on it, and the made a wheel out of the main gear in the thing. Well, I went to PBL and I got lucky. They found one, but I found out something new. Is Northwest Shortline, another company that's recently been reconstituted by a new owner, will make you specialized replacement gearing. Very important to know. All these companies, yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, I noticed we lost Scott. Were you going to say something, Adam?
Yeah, I've got to get going.
Yeah.
But
okay.
It's been amazing talking with you guys. John, it's good seeing you.
Yeah, good seeing you too.
Doug, miss you. We need to get together.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
You guys as well, John. John, it's been a while, and Dave, I'd love to meet you in person.
Yeah, you bet. Same here.
I got one funny story about Adam is we're both on Facebook and we got some tussle with this big blowhard bully, and he kept calling us names and stuff. The both of us, and all Adam had to say is, "I want to meet you." And that guy. It was crickets after that. He was off the line and everything.
Well,
He doesn't know he's just a big teddy bear.
That's all right. Keep the impression up. It was great to see you scare that guy for once. You know, it was a beautiful thing.
Somebody had to, for God's sakes, man.
That was a beautiful. That was one of those few shining moments on Facebook where the right words were said. You know,
Yeah.
and a bully mysteriously disappeared. It was great. You know.
Yeah, I just wanted to continue the conversation in person. That's all.
Yeah, it would have been a short conversation.
Yeah, I'm not saying anything, but you know.
All right.
Yeah, that was fun.
That was great seeing you, Adam.
Absolutely, man. I miss you guys.
Last couple trips. Next time I'm through Salt Lake, I'll make a point where I'll stay with Doug, and I'll make a point that you come on, get you.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah,
Hopefully
we'll
by
do
then
something.
I'll
Even
have
if it ain't
something
right,
on
we'll
here.
do it.
Oh, that's fact. I already can guarantee you that. Let's try to do something wrong. Yeah, it's good seeing you guys.
Yeah, it's great.
Well,
seeing you.
thanks for your time, Adam. Really appreciate you taking the time to come on.
All
It's
right.
good to see you too.
And gentlemen, it's been a pleasure.
Take care.
Yeah,
Thanks,
Bye,
Adam.
Adam.
All right.
See you guys.
So long.
Hey, a fellow railroader, goodbye.
Okay. It looks like Adam's
Yeah.
sort of there we go.
He's out.
He's out. So I do want to thank you guys. I figure I don't know what happened to Scott. He just kind of disappeared on us, but I did see somebody walk in behind him right before he disappeared. So he might have got busted or
Yeah.
something.
Well,
He's one of them that still have kids at home.
Yeah.
Oh, well, there you go.
Yeah.
So I do want to thank you guys. I'm going to go ahead and stop the stream here. And if you want to hang on the stream here for a second, we'll have our goodbyes. Before we go, I do want to thank everybody also for watching.
Mhm.
And I'd like to remind everybody that we have we had a video about logging inclines of the Yosemite Valley come out yesterday. That's actually a very popular video right now. You may want to look on the sketch or on the channel, the main channel to find that. I think you'll probably enjoy it. And also, I wanted to mention that next Saturday, it's Halloween. It's the 5th Saturday of the month, and we have a special show coming out. That was an interview I did with Michelle Kempema. You probably know her from the Colorado Model Railroad Museum. Well, she's also a member of the train crew on Patreon, and we sat down and talked to her for what was that, Dave? An hour and a half, something like that.
It was closer to an hour and a half, I recall. Yeah, it was pretty good.
So, and that's going to come out next Saturday.
Yeah.
So that's it for the stream, and I'll see you guys in about 20 seconds. All right, just hang in with me here.
All right.
Thank you.
I'll be right back. Okay, I'll be back.
Excellent. Thanks, you guys.